In the months that followed the events that led to the overthrow of Ben Ali in Tunisia, a banner hung quite close to the French embassy on Avenue Habib Bourguiba that simply read, "Thank you, Facebook." I had the pleasure very recently, 10 days ago, of visiting Libya, and I saw similar messages all over the streets, on walls, pretty much all around Tripoli. Much has been said about the importance of technology and what has come to be referred to as the Arab Spring. And of course, we'll hear from our distinguished panelists about that role, and we'll hear some anecdotes and stories, some of them gripping stories about the role that social networks and more broadly technology played in this movement, and I should say is still playing. But we'll try also to look beyond. Indeed, it takes a certain set of skills to tear down an autocracy, to get rid of a tyrant, and a different set of skills altogether to build a country up. And so these countries are facing very new challenges now. Beyond that, we will look at how technology might help us to bridge much broader issues that are facing not just countries in transition, but pretty much any country in the world. And those point to a certain crisis in modern democracy. How do you resolve the tension between an increasing number of global issues that cannot be resolved over the course of one mandate of a leader in any given country, can't be adequately confronted by one country on its own, especially given that we're talking about the nation state and quite pyramidal structures. So how do you resolve the two? To begin with, please, Alec, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. So in thinking about the context of the Arab Spring, I actually think it might be helpful to back up a little bit more. And it's interesting listening to the conversations over the past day, and that I think will be taking course over the next day. There's a topic that's almost rude to talk about aloud, that I want to spend a minute or two on, and that's power. And one of the things that I think we've seen in North Africa, throughout the Middle East, but I would argue globally, is we're seeing a very significant shift in geopolitical power, from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens. So I think a lot of the commentary about power is on a geographic basis. People talk about the supposed transfer of power from west to east, from the United States and Europe to Asia, or from the global north to the global south. Whether that is true or not, or the extent to which that is true, I think that that's actually far less significant than the global shift in power from hierarchies, like the nation state, like federal governments, to citizens and networks of citizens. And I think that what happened in the Arab Spring is a manifestation of that. And this shift in power is made possible by connection technologies, by social media, by the increasing ubiquity and power of mobile networks. And what I think is happening, and we've seen this just in the last few weeks in the United States with the debate around online piracy legislation, is that you no longer need a very large institution or a federal government to build large, powerful movements. And I think that this is manifesting itself within the commercial marketplace, it's manifesting itself within elections, and it's manifesting itself within transfers of power globally. And so I wanted to provide that context for a minute or two. Just if someone were to ask me, working for Hillary Clinton over the last 3 years, what's the one thing that you've learned? It's that there's a significant shift of power. And it's not about west to east or north to south. It's about hierarchies like the nation state to citizens and networks of citizens.
Khaled, perhaps you could give us a few stories about the very basic problems that your job consisted in as first, well, part of the NTC. Just as we were talking about a few days ago in Tripoli, it first was simply switching back on the cell phone network and internet.
Good afternoon, everyone. So there are technology played a very critical role within the Libyan uprising. So if I can summarize, there were 4 stages. So the Libyan uprising happened on the 17th of February. So before the 17th of February, a few months before, things start building up on social media networks, Twitters and other places, requesting change. On the day on the 17th, things became more real, and people went on the street, and the previous regime, the way they dealt with the protest was a bit brutal, and so you know what happened. The main challenge, and that takes us to the next point where technology played an important role. Libya had no media, no free press. There were no international journalism in Libya. So the first challenge we had is we want to tell our story. We want to say what happened in the ground. Things started in the east of Libya, mainly in the city of Benghazi. But what Gaddafi regime did, they switched off the internet, which was very centralized, controlled from Tripoli to the whole eastern part of Libya. So with no free media and without an internet, how would we upload our videos that captured on mobile phones and so on? So that was the first challenge. The second one, a couple of days later, they shut down the international calls to and out of Libya. And so no one can call international media to start speaking on the phone, describing what's happening. A few weeks after that, they shut down the mobile telephone network locally. And that was a major challenge, because during those days, there were real fights on the ground, and you need to communicate to say, get out or come here or something like that. And so that was a challenge. So what we did, and you need to imagine that in Libya, everything was controlled, very centralized in Tripoli. So I was lucky to be there at the time and working with a group of local engineers to we built a new network of VSAT satellites, which enabled some internet connectivities. But in the very early days, there were really handful and 3 to 4 laptops that were describing what you have seen in the early days of the Libyan uprising. So all what you've seen up to maybe the early March was done through a handful of laptops, because at the time there was no international journalists in the country. Which led us after that to start working on the issue of the internet and on the mobile local network. I'll just summarize quickly, Felix. So on the internet, what happened is that Libya gets its main internet through a submarine cable from Italy to Libya, to Tripoli, and that's under the control of the Gaddafi regime. So what we did is we laid a new fiber from the east of Libya to Egypt, and it's an engineering task. There is a lot of challenges there, but then there is a lot of politically as who will turn the internet into Libya, and that was a very challenging time. And it's good to have good friends like Alec, R.Ross, who we worked closely during that time to help us in getting internet connectivity inside the country after we rebuilt the local network in the eastern part. Which is thank you, Alex, for the support. After that, we had the problem of mobile network. As you can, Libya, its mobile penetration is over 100%, and so everybody used mobile phones. So to not have a mobile phone, and during the time, it's a life or death experience. So what we did is we were lucky to get hold of an old demo HLR. HLR is the hard part of the GSM network, but that was the demo. That was meant to be for 10,000 subscribers or something like that. And what we had some interesting time and playing around with it, and we managed to reconfigure it to support about 1 million subscribers, and that addressed at the time major issue. So now people can use their mobile phones. After that, the way the conflict folded in Libya, we had the eastern part was free, but then we had different regions that are not connected, and not connected, like the city of Misrata and the Zintan region. And now the issue was how we communicate with these places, and that was a major. We resolved the VSAT network and so on. Once that is, we start to be able to communicate. Things were. Help was better managed to organize and so on. Now that Libya is free, we are turning to technology to improve the quality of life in Libya, as well as to hopefully democratize our new government to improve transparency and accountability. And that's the eLibya project that we're chatting about.
And we're going to dwell on that afterwards, about where does the job start once you start rebuilding, and what are the challenges you're facing. But before we go there, what you just described, Khaled, points to a very different use of technology, at the beginning at least, and of social networks in particular, between the use that we have in France or in Britain or in the US. We make friends, we flirt with people, we get together, we organize parties, we do a whole bunch of things thanks to social networks. It's a very different use when the challenge that you're facing is simply to let your family know that you're alive, and social networks are the only means to actually do that. So it's no longer about the same issue. It becomes a crucial instrument. And perhaps, Katie, you can tell us a few stories about how Twitter was used in those months in Egypt, in other places, as a means to sort of change things very dramatically.
Sure, so thanks for having me. One of the premises at Twitter that really moves us is that we believe that the open exchange of information can have a positive impact in the world. And it's really important for us to be able to reach everyone on the planet, and at the same time build a business in a way that makes us proud. And one of that is making our platform more accessible to everyone, via a mobile phone, via a fancy iPad, via your laptop. So we're working hard at making that accessible, and we delight in the use cases that people show and demonstrate, like Khaled in Libya and Wael Ghonim in Egypt, and even Julia Probst, who's here today. She's a German user who's deaf and tweets what isn't heard on the soccer field. She reads the lips of the soccer players and teams and tweets them. And I think in all of these different cases and all of these different use cases, it provides a platform for all of these voices to be heard. Their voices to be heard and amplified and challenged at times, no matter where you are on any single device. And what we saw in the Arab Spring is not necessarily a triumph of technology, but a triumph of humanity, of people being able to connect and discover in real time these events. If it's a revolution, if it's an activist who's jailed, if it's an activist who's attacked, if it's the embassy responding to an American citizen who's in trouble. It's really remarkable at how users are using this. It's governments, it's activists, it's diplomats, it's individual users. Jack Dorsey, who was on stage yesterday, talked about this amazing event that happened a few years ago in the Hudson River where a plane landed, and an individual with only 20 followers started tweeting it and showed a picture, and that first picture from the ground, well, not the ground, I guess, from the river, was, you know, distributed throughout many publications. And so, you know, it doesn't matter what kind of, you know, to Alec's point, what type of institution you represent. It is that shift of power from institutions to individuals that's really made an impact.
Wow. Khaled, perhaps you pointed to eLibya, which is the major project that you're in charge of, which is a vast overhaul of a number of administrative procedures, looking at e-education, the challenges of e-government in general. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about, now that we've talked a bit about how the technology was used to bring regimes down, you can talk to us about what it is, what comes next. How do you build things up?
Okay, it's a difficult question, but basically we are now trying to rebuild the whole country with no institution. So how would you go about that? There are different initiatives currently happening, and the one that I'm leading is called eLibya. So the eLibya, it's an initiative that has really two aims. Number one is to improve quality of life in Libya through means of technology. The second one is to create a new marketplace, and we believe that it's really the economy of things will help in rebuilding the country. So eLibya consists of 4 initiatives. First one is the Open Government initiative. The Open Government is things to do with transparency in government and accountability, among other things, which is we feel fundamental in building our new government and the new process in Libya. Second one is e-government. So this is to do with all the government procedures and things make life simpler for the citizen. The second two are, I think, very critical to the success of the rebuilding Libya. One is e-commerce, and the last one is e-learning, which we feel is the most critical one. So we want to develop different learning platform and learning mechanism to reach everyone and to turn to technology to develop that. So e-learning is a fundamental part of that. So what we are trying to do is, and imagine we want to do all that, and our infrastructure is not really there yet. So we need to build the infrastructure, we need to build our framework. We have a very strange regulatory system where we have the telecom regulator owns the telecom companies, and which doesn't really work. So it's a lot of work coming ahead, but basically we are looking at eLibya as a mean to help rebuilding the country.
One of the pillars of eLibya you just mentioned is e-learning, and I know this is a topic that's close to the heart of Nicolas N.Princen. Perhaps you can tell us, Nicolas, you're facing a different challenge, of course, than Khaled, but how do you see the importance of e-learning, among others, as a tool to sort of modernize government in general?
Well, first of all, hi everyone. It's really interesting, and the project Khaled is leading, I think, is one of the most interesting in our space, in the space of technology and politics. eLibya is really something you should be interested in if you want to follow the interaction between technology and politics. I was fortunate enough to visit Libya with President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron, and the level of energy that you can feel that country is just amazing, and that's the kind of energy you want to channel into something great, powered by technology. Outspoken people. I was extremely struck by women in Libya who really came to us and had a lot of stories to tell, and the level of energy is just very encouraging. A lot of the challenges we face, I thought, are pretty much the same as you guys. The thing is, you are lucky enough to build that from scratch. And that's a provocative assertion to say lucky enough, but I think it's going to be a really interesting laboratory, so to speak, for us to learn from. And that's the impression I had in Benghazi, is I'm going to learn from these people before I teach anything. I want to make 4 points out of what you said, Khaled. France is very focused on. The number one is open government. Rohan's going to talk about that, but we lead a strong agenda on open government and open data. And we launched a month and a half ago our open data platform called data.gov.fr. It's about transparency, it's about accountability, and it's 300,000 databases online for companies and new services to be created. The second thing, and we've discussed this with Khaled a lot because I think that's a real topic that can interest everyone, and it's the same thing in France or in any European country, by the way, facing the crisis, or in Libya, is there's a real opportunity to refuel our economies with the real entrepreneurial spirit. And that's something we've been discussing, all of us at this panel, is how do you build a stronger entrepreneurial spirit in your country to build new companies and, you know, build the economy back from scratch, pretty much. And that's something we're really working on and happy to share. If you take France, for example, there's a major change in what youth is thinking and the ambitions they have for themselves. 10 years ago, the polls indicated that French youth wanted to be civil servants in a majority. Today, if you ask them, they want to create their business. And that's a major shift. It's a generational shift, I believe. The third thing I wanted to say is, and that's something we discussed with Khaled, is you want to make the use of technology very concrete for your people. You need to win on the grounds. It's not just about saying how social networks are cool. It's about showing how technology can change the world. And one thing we should focus on, I believe, is smart cities. There was a panel on this yesterday, and I know in France we really want to build Paris as a platform. In May we'll have a summit called the New City Summit, built by the New City Foundation, my friend Jean Rossant, and thinking of how you can implement technology at the basic level of the place people live and where they interact, I think is where we're going to earn a lot of legitimacy for the tech community to be involved in, you know, the building of the common good. And the fourth thing, and I think that's the most interesting, well, to me at least, is e-education and e-learning. I have a very strong feeling about this because when I was in the streets of Benghazi, I thought to myself, okay, so this is pretty much over for us. It's now to the Libyan people to, you know, take their destiny, build their state, and I have nothing else to share with them. But, you know, I thought to myself, this is kind of frustrating, and this is a global community. We work together. We should think of something useful we could do. And I thought about that, and I thought to myself, well, I think we're at the fringe of a third revolution, so to speak. The first one, I believe, was the revolution of tools and infrastructure. And that's what you said. The basic thing is, hey guys, I need a network. I need mobile phones, and I need laptops. So devices and infrastructure. The second one is access to services and social networks. Do I have access to Twitter from Libya or from any other country? No isn't the same answer as yes, and it changes a lot, as we've seen in the past few months. But now I believe, once these countries are now free, I'm really challenged by the question of, what do people really want to share? And what's the kind of valuable content you want to find in those networks to push to the next limit? And that's when I thought, it's really about education. And the conclusion is really easy to follow once you see what terrorist organizations do. They try to tackle education in these countries. That's what they do. They try to, you know, they finance grants, universities for people who will abide by their law and who will carry the message. And when you think about that, you say, well, listen, education really is the key. And it has, the tech community has technology being really focused on education, on the spread of educational content, on the spread of that type of intelligence. I'm not sure, and that's a challenge you know, I want to share with our community here, is to say that if you take a step back, I think the web has really been great at bringing entertainment online, and we're talking a lot about that, and it's great. You could say that 2011 was a major shift for music online. Music is spreading through social networks, and it's changing the whole experience, the consumption of music. I think we've done a great job for news. News organizations definitely are online, and that content is available, and there's a lot of thinking around that, despite the problems with the business models and stuff. But I thought to myself, what's really happening with education in that space? I mean, can I access valuable educational content on the internet? And that's why I think there's room for improvement. And because education is part of what governments think about, I think that's one of the topics we should focus on. And at least that's something we're thinking about in France. Because, and the link to Libya is that whenever you digitalize something, it's always the same thing. When you digitalize, and for example, that's going to be the case for the digitalization of education, basically you socialize the experience. We know that now. You pretty much privatize, or at least open that space to competition. That means public and public-private partnership. So e-education tomorrow isn't only going to be about governments, it's going to be about companies, and we've seen some this morning in this forum. And the third is that it internationalizes. Digitalization is internationalization. So whoever's going to build the best platform for education and e-education is going to be able to share it with the world. And I think the best way to build democracy is to rely on that. And I think that's really something we could focus on, not only governments, but the whole community assembled here. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and I'm happy to work with Libby on e-learning.
And they're very happy to be working with you, I know.
Absolutely.
Especially given that the learning of foreign languages was strictly forbidden under Gaddafi. Rohan, perhaps you could tell us about what in Britain is the focus of how you guys are focusing on bringing in technology to improve, to renew, to modernize government.
Right. Well, thank you. It's such a big topic, this, I think, and it might just be worth me focusing on a couple of things, all flowing from Alec's fantastic starting point, which is how is technology altering the relationship between the citizen and the state, and between people and one another. And I think he's absolutely right to say that it's eroding the kind of power asymmetries that used to exist. So what are we doing in the UK to sort of essentially piggyback on your brilliant work? Well, one of the things we're doing is trying to push through what we call open source politics. So this is throwing open the doors of government and using crowdsourcing tools to give people a much bigger say. So some examples of this. We had a piece of legislation last year that we call the Freedom Bill, which was full of provisions to try and promote civil liberties. Well, that piece of legislation was entirely crowdsourced. We created a platform where people could feed in their ideas of what should populate that bill. And, you know, us being sort of gullible, we took that, put it in Parliament, and it's now law. We're doing a similar process on deregulation. We call it the Red Tape Challenge, and we have a specific program of that focused on disruptive business models, i.e. companies doing things differently and potentially falling foul of regulations that were designed for a completely different age. Crowdsourcing finance is a great example. Peer-to-peer finance is a great example of a new business model falling foul of regulations designed perhaps 50 years ago. And so using crowdsourcing to gather those ideas, those suggestions, those problems that can then inform our policy making. One more example of this, which I think just shows the kind of pent-up demand on the part of the public to play a bigger role, is something we did last year. As you might know, we found ourselves in a situation, like a lot of governments, of having to reduce spending. But the way we went about it, I think, was interesting. We used crowdsourcing to ask public sector workers for their ideas of how to save money. We said to them, look, you deal with sort of government and inefficiency the whole time, or potentially do. How do you think we could save money? And we had about 300,000 responses from public sector workers in the first few weeks. It was an incredible outpouring of ideas and creativity, which we then mercilessly used to help bring down spending. So I think that whole area of crowdsourcing, of opening up government to the wisdom of the crowd, I'm really excited about it. I think we're only just scratching the surface of what might be achieved. Another way in which we're trying to go with the grain of this shift in asymmetry is shift in power, is open data, as Nicolas mentioned. Really, there's nothing particularly original about what we're doing. I blatantly copied our agenda from Barack Obama and Senator Coburn and their spending transparency bill. I think, though, what we have done that's potentially useful is just driven that to its extreme. So essentially every single data set that the British government has is now being published or will soon be published. Health data, education data, crime data, spending data. And we're creating a right to data so that you, the developers, you, the public, can ask for that data set and it will be published immediately. So I think that's all very exciting. I mean, something to just tell you about, though, which is, I think, exciting me at the moment, is this question of how should government use data? So obviously we should release it so you lot can build apps and services and companies. But in truth, at number 10 Downing Street, we're not making use of any of that data ourselves. It's as if the information revolution never happened. And so we are building an app for the Prime Minister that will sit on his iPad that will allow him to interact with government data as well as data drawn from Google and Twitter to really have an understanding of what's going on across the public sector. And so, as I say, as well as releasing data to the crowd, to developers, to companies, to anyone who wants to use it, we're also starting to think about how we make use of it ourselves. And I think that's quite interesting that government might start to benefit from this exponential increase in data that developers around the world are making use of. So I think that's quite exciting. So crowdsourcing, open data, and then finally how government itself uses the data, all of that hopefully helping to build a better society, a stronger society, and a better government.
I hope I can get that app, Rohan. We talked about public-private partnerships and how technology somehow is bringing the two even more together and encouraging collaboration. This question goes to all of you. How are you guys all collaborating? There's a paradigm shift. There's a new generation sort of dealing with this paradigm shift. How is it that you start working together? How is it that you help each other? Alec?
Sure. So it's interesting. I do think that there is a group of people coming into government today who historically simply wouldn't have been in government. I mean, my background was as an entrepreneur. Katie worked at the White House and with me at the State Department. She's an entrepreneur. Khaled, now leading ELibya before he was a part of the revolution, was in the private sector. I mean, this is sort of from whence we come, and frankly, for many of us, being amidst you, we're sort of with our tribe here, more so than at our big bureaucratic building. And one of the things that's really interesting is that as we seek to drive change through our organizations, some of the natural collaborations that we have are more likely to be transnational or transcontinental in nature than with some of the traditional bureaucracy. So one thing that Nicolas and I did together is we brought together leaders from 21 countries to focus on how we can innovate within government. I don't think you had just overthrown your government at that point, and you came up to visit with us in Paris.
It was 3 days in government.
You were 3 days in government, so we were still looking for Gaddafi at that point.
And he was by far the coolest guest.
Yeah, you were the coolest guest. You're the coolest guest up here too. So, but part of what we're trying to do is build partnerships across continents in ways that are atypical, because in the same way in which there's sort of a common culture that I sort of feel in a manner of speaking in settings like this one, even though people are from many different countries, there's no difference when you bring in people from government. And so part of what we're trying to do is build transnational partnerships and relationships that actually turn into a public good. And one of the things that I say to government leaders around the world, from Hillary Clinton to mid-level bureaucrats, is they understand the disruptions that are brought on by the programs that we're trying to create, is that the 21st century is a lousy time to be a control freak. And the connectivity that your citizens now have, the transfer of power that's taking place, means a loss of control. And this loss of control scares people in government, but it's good. And if in this environment of disruption and loss of control, you can do things like what they're doing in the United Kingdom, which is give up control of their data and give it to the community, make it accessible to everyday citizens, make it accessible to geeks. That kind of content can be mashed up and products developed faster and better than than a government itself could have ever done through a normal tender process. So what we're trying to do, sort of a community amongst ourselves, but we've built one with 21 countries in it now, is to take conversations the likes of which is happening here at DLD and partnerships that might be typically built around building an app or building a product or service for a lifestyle or entertainment industry and bringing it into government.
Yeah. I'd say there's a very sort of healthy arms race going on. You know, spending transparency I got from Obama, crime mapping from states in cities in America. There's a very healthy sort of competition, I think, in the best possible sense. Another really important dimension, that's why it's so great Katie's here, is this relationship between governments and companies like Twitter, companies like Facebook and Google and thousands of others besides. A lot of the crowdsourcing exercises we did, for example, we used Facebook, we used Twitter in a way that I think governments haven't necessarily been comfortable doing, because there's not an official procurement process. You haven't, what is the security like? I'm sure it's great, but the being able to sort of step through that looking glass and take a risk, to let go of power, as Alec says, it's so useful to be able to point at other countries doing things, other companies doing things, and that sort of synergy, that arms race is really the reason that I think all of us have been able to do the small steps we've been taking.
It does bring about some funny paranoia, though, because, I'll just speak personally for a second. I've been accused of creating a quote, new military-industrial complex with America's technology companies. And the fact that nobody's making any money on this doesn't seem to matter. But it is interesting, part of the boundaries that we are testing, which I think are good to test, is in developing public-private partnerships, it does test the traditional boundaries between the private sector and government.
Yeah, and that's, sorry, is this working? Yeah. That's really something we've been working on at a global level. And in France, for example, we launched an informal advisory board for the president called the Conseil National du Numérique, the National Digital Council, through which every single piece of legislation which has an impact on our digital economy, information technology businesses is going to go through. And it's a way, well, first of all, not to screw up and not to build some legislation that's going to, bring down or affect negatively this business, but also just to imagine what the real solutions are and put this tech community try to talk with them to imagine new solutions to very basic problems. Education is one of them. Jobs is one of them. Using social networks. People use social networks to find jobs today. They don't just go through the traditional government channels. So there's room for dialogue. There's room to build something together. And that's something at least the G8 countries tried to bring at the international level with the EG8. I was fortunate enough to work on, and the EG8 really was about that. It was about showing the world at one of the highest possible level of global governance, which is the G8, that G8 countries officially recognize the impact, the responsibility, and the opportunity to work with private sector, and that's why the CEOs of great companies around the world were invited to Paris to share on this, to say, okay, we recognize your impact on the world, we really want to benefit from it, we want to dialogue with you guys. Of course, there are rules we have to respect together, but there's most of all opportunities we have to explore. And I think that methodology that we kind of all try to carry on as maybe a new generation with new ideas and new paradigms is a strong trend that every single person in this room could build on and participate in, I'm sure.
There's a very scary impulse that you come across in government. I don't know if it happens so much in the private sector, which is something good's happening, we should build our own, right? These social networks seem to be doing great things. We should build one. These search engines allow people to get information. Government should build one of those. And one of the things that we all try and do together, I think, is sort of fight off that impulse. And that's where being able to really understand what the private sector's doing and how we might partner with you rather than sort of knuckle-headedly try and build our own is fantastic. Because you give a government an IT budget, they're going to want to use it, and let's just try and make sure they use it on the right sort of things rather than the wrong sort of things.
If I can add one thing here. So when we talk about ELearning and how we can rebuild that sector, there is no way we can do things from scratch, and public-private partnership is in the heart. One of the things that I'm keen to share here and propose to people at the DLD here is, if you had the opportunity to start something from scratch, which we have, we are really keen to work with innovative people to try new technology or new ideas and to experiment with in places where probably harder to do in a more developed infrastructure. So this is an open invitation for anyone with interesting ideas, and we're really keen to work with startups or established companies and government as well.
There was indeed a few months ago I visited with a French delegation, visited London, and we were there to try to learn from the riots panel and several people associated with sort of dealing with the riots, cleaning up, etc. And interestingly enough, exactly what you pointed to, Rohan, was explained to me. Rather than try to build an alternative riot social network, they tried to think about the way that rioters were gathering thanks to Twitter, and they were dealing with one particularly acute problem, which was that people were gathering to clean up after the riots and becoming extremely frustrated because sometimes they were coming, far too many people were coming to clean up. Some of them got really angry and actually started tearing down stuff themselves. So Twitter became a means to actually try to most usefully gather people in the right places where actually help was most needed. Perhaps, Katie, you have stories along the same lines of how Twitter's been used to productively bring people together.
Yeah, I think that's probably our favorite example of a situation that was really scary, right? And last August when the riots occurred, and in the UK, and N.Princen had already been very savvy on Twitter and other social networks, and then seen this really scary time, but then the community took action and using a hashtag riot cleanup, and people could come together and stop some of the mayhem and stop the nonsense and gather together and clean up. And technology and these platforms being used for good and for collaboration. I think another really interesting example, and it's fun seeing all of you guys up here and thinking, and as you were talking, I was wondering, I wonder who has it harder, Khaled trying to build technology from a brand new government, or Alec, Rohan, and Nicolas trying to take technology from existing government. So time will tell. But looking at South Sudan, the newest country in our world family, and when South Sudan became a country, they started a Twitter account at Rep, South Sudan, and thinking how amazing at it is this in this time that these new countries are being born, and there's a new Wikipedia entry that's getting edited at this moment, and that people are using Google Maps to edit and add all the cities because they had not been there before, and drawing the lines, that they're using Twitter to be able to communicate that, here is our government, we are open for business, and the same with you. So, these tools can be used for good. If it's communities organizing, if it's new governments building, even as of today, I think there are 35 heads of state on Twitter, and it's very interesting seeing the different dynamics that they have together and with their citizens and with world citizens. When President Medvedev joined Twitter, Barack Obama sent him a tweet and said, I guess we don't need that red phone anymore. And even, there are different personalities like Paul Kagame, who I bet if any of you tweet to him right now, he'll probably reply you by the end of this panel. He's really engaging. And Hugo Chavez, who at once called Twitter and all these different technologies a tool of terror, now has over something like 2.5 million followers. So, to various extents, from the average citizen on the ground helping to clean up, some destruction, to a president of a massive country being able to engage and communicate in real time.
Kagame is definitely more responsive than Ashton Kutcher, I can tell you that much.
He does it
That's a good
himself.
thing.
He does it himself too on his BlackBerry. Like I can see, and he'll get mad. If somebody says something mean to him on his BlackBerry, he'll respond right there. I've been with him when he's done it. It's quite a sight.
No, definitely. I actually witnessed in real time a few months ago a conversation going on between Syrian activists and who were thanking with really, you could feel tears in their eyes. We're thanking Mia Farrow and Ashton Kutcher and several others for what they had been doing for Syria on their own. So I can see that. We were talking about evil and good uses of technology. Khaled, you had when you took over, you essentially found a lot of technology that had been misused or used for very evil reasons in Libya. How are you using this technology now to do good things?
So what Felix is referring to here are low-for interception and internet monitoring tools that's used by government. So second day in the revolution in Benghazi, first thing we did is we went and took out all the low-for interception tools in the local telecom center. And when we took over Tripoli, late August, we shut down all the low-for interception tools. And so the answer is currently we are not using them, and we are hopefully not planning to use them, at least in the near future, until we have a legitimate government in place and a proper legal system, if we are gonna use them. And currently there is a lots of talks within Libyan communities about use or not use, and it's the anti-not using low-for interception tool is by far where things are heading. So unfortunately, these low-for interception tools are used by law enforcement in lots of countries, and these are equipment that are manufactured by most developed companies and are sold all over the world, and it's very difficult to control the use of them once you have them. So these, in fact, the early days in the revolution in Libya, so that's in the 20th of February, in Tripoli there was a big organization of mass protest, and it was put down because the use of this low-for interception, they could find out who are the key individuals who are behind this protest. So it's an open question how we deal with that. Currently, we are strongly opposing the use of low-for interception tools. Better not to use them than use them, at least until we have a proper legitimate government in place and legal system to support that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest things that concerns me as part of the aftermath that began with the Green Movement in June of 2009 through the Arab Spring. If you are a dictator and you have access to money, part of what you learned from Iran in 2009 and from the Arab Spring is that your citizens are newly empowered by virtue of having access to these tools, and you can either accept that or you can fight it. And so in every in every national capital right now, heads of state are making a decision about how they are going to try to harness these technologies to either serve their citizens or surveil and try to control their citizens. And I'm not horribly optimistic in this regard. And frankly, Western, including American technology companies, often play a very non-productive role in this respect. And so I think that one of the things that worries me, while I think that the empowerment of citizens is very good and important, these technologies have a dual edge. My boss, Hillary Clinton, has said that our information networks are like nuclear power. You can use it to fuel a city or destroy a city. And too much of what I see by virtue of this, the seat that I sit in, is I see too many governments saying, okay, if my citizens are going to become more empowered, I am now going to invest very, very heavily in sophisticated technologies to know exactly what is happening on these networks, exactly what's happening in email, exactly what's happening in mobile networks. So unfortunately, the more I know in this respect, the more concerned I become about the power of technology in the wrong people's hands.
And I think one of the big sort of questions for certainly this year and the years to come is, should we start to think of technology that allows the surveillance that Khaled and Alec is talking about? Should we think of that in the same way to think about arms as we think about traditional weapons? And ought to be this type of surveillance technology should be subject to export controls. It's certainly one of the things that I think is really going to come to the fore. We've seen similar issues over cyber attacks, where you're not technically breaking international law if you launch a cyber attack on a city, even though it may have the same kind of impact as dropping a bomb on that city. And I think this area of what should the international community do, including civil society, do to stop the spread of this type of surveillance, I think is increasingly going to be important, and it really matters to all of us. We've seen the debate over SOPA in America. I wonder whether we should be similarly agitated about sort of SOPA type and much worse than SOPA technologies being used around the world. Certainly, I feel it's something we can be doing much more about.
There's perhaps we could go back to that just a second, almost as a conclusion. Alec, much has been said about the internet suitcase. What are the other projects that you've been sort of overseeing to actually contribute in a way to countering this behavior of autocrats?
Sure. So by way of background, since I've been at the State Department, we've invested about $70 million in tools to help people exercise their universal rights on the internet. So to help people stay anonymous on the internet, to be able to circumvent government censorship and such things. We're only public about 2 of them. So the internet, there's this thing, Internet in a Suitcase, which you can read about, where part of the idea is that using relatively sophisticated network technologies in something that would fit in the size of a suitcase, can you create redundant bandwidth in an environment where the central government is trying to throttle down access? Another example, the only other one that I can speak about publicly, is a panic button. So a lot of what we've seen is that as activists have been getting arrested in places like Syria, the first thing that the secret police will do is they'll take your mobile phone, they'll see your address book, they'll see the text messages you've sent, they'll see who your friends are on social networks, and that then becomes this guide for the secret police for dissent movements. And so we've supported the development of a panic button where if you're about to be arrested or if you feel like you are in danger, you can hit a code and it wipes out, it stores to the cloud your contacts, your address book, your communications and such things. And it also sends out a distress signal so that your friends will know, hey, you're being taken down by the authorities. So there are tools, the vast majority of which people are using in these environments. They have no idea that the State Department is the one who supported their development financially. But we are completely unapologetic about this. We believe that Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is that people have the freedom of expression, access to a free press, and the right to communicate over any form of media possible, we believe that in the year 2012, that means the internet. And so we are very proudly supporting technologies that allow people to exercise their universal rights in closed environments.
I would like to thank you all. I'd like to end on a good note, especially dedicated to you, Khaled. 7 years ago, a country that had just been through a revolution, Georgia, was ranked by the World Bank 131st country in the world to do business in. And since then, Saakashvili's government has implemented a number of reforms that in many ways are reminiscent or should inspire you for ELibya. And the result was last year, Georgia was ranked number 11. So thank you all. Thank you so much.